Okay, let's go ahead and get started. If there are any questions before we start, go ahead and ask. Any questions? Okay, hope you enjoyed the video last week. That was one of my favorites because it's really informative. If you didn't see it before the second exam, we'll need to set you up with a time so that you can see it. It does a lot of work describing the historical background of Machiavelli and just his, wonderful with sort of getting us to know him as a human being a little bit more. But today we're going to plunge right into The Prince, and we're going to talk about some of his initial ideas. We're also going to talk about interpretation. Okay? We did interpretation in the first unit, but we didn't really talk about interpretation. Okay? And with Machiavelli's Prince, interpretation becomes really important because there are a variety of rather starkly different ways to view the book. So we'll be talking about that today too. But let's look at the very beginning of the book, at the letter of dedication to Lorenzo D'Medici. Lorenzo was the Prince of Florence, who had come to power, and the result of that had been Machiavelli and other people being tortured and exiled. Okay, so Lorenzo is the prince that threw out the Republican form of government. And Machiavelli, though he has had this horrible experience happen to him, is out there in his country home writing The Prince, and he's writing it for this reason, among others. He's writing it so that he can give it as a gift to Lorenzo. Okay. Now, some people say all that Machiavelli is doing is writing a sort of elaborate, job resume or application, and that he really doesn't believe any of this. But if you look at both the Prince and the Discourses, which is his book about Republican government, there's a lot of correspondence between the two. There's a lot of themes in common. The Discourses does not contradict the Prince, as I think Henry Kissinger pointed out in the video. The two go together pretty well. One is about founding, the other is about maintaining. So I don't think it's the case that we can just say, well, it's just a job resume, he doesn't believe any of it. But certainly, the reason why he's writing it now, and the reason why he's dedicating it to Lorenzo, is because he's hoping it will catch his attention and give him a couple of ideas. First, that Machiavelli is pretty smart, and maybe ought to be listened to. And secondly, Machiavelli's loyal, because he's taken the time to write this and give it to Lorenzo, and not to somebody else. So, yes, indeed, it is at least designed partly to gain favor, and it is a book that is very practical. In fact, that's why most people, if they admire Machiavelli today, it's because he was so incredibly practical. Okay, he doesn't use a lot of words in this book. It's a short book. He doesn't give a lot of elaborations of, his general ideas. He gets right to the heart of the matter. It makes points very quickly and illustrates them with his examples. So it is a how-to book, a book about how to be an effective prince. Now, there is some speculation in your introduction, which you don't need to read, but you can read if you want to, gets into this a little bit. There's some speculation that the book was originally meant for Giovanni de' Medici, who was the brother of the Pope and Lorenzo's brother. They were related, okay? And that maybe Machiavelli's first idea was to get into the good graces of Giovanni and therefore the Pope, okay, and to be able to work for the church, because he thought that if he could advise the church would become effective enough in its political and military endeavors to do the unification itself, okay? So that's a possibility, but the church was not interested, regardless of whether he ever wrote this for them. The church was not interested in Machiavelli at this time, so the Pope indeed did not entertain Machiavelli in any of his requests for an audience or anything like that. So then he either turns to Lorenzo first or second, in other words, okay? But Lorenzo looks to him to be the most receptive. Now, it's not uncommon at this time for people to give gifts of their intellectual ability to noblemen, okay? So this shouldn't seem too unusual. Astronomers, physicists, philosophers, artists, musicians, they were all looking for some noble person to give their output to in exchange for support. Okay, that's how these people survived, was by finding patrons to support them. Okay, so Machiavelli is looking for that patron too, somebody to support him, somebody to hire him. So that was not unusual. And so he writes this effusive letter to Lorenzo at the beginning of the book. And again, this is, you read this and you go, oh my God, this guy is just, kissing up to it's awful. But this was a letter that would be very similar in tone to other letters dedicating works to princes. They were always very effusive. They were always very complimentary, debasing oneself in light of the majesty of the nobleman. In fact, in this letter, Machiavelli isn't quite so complimentary as it first seems, but let's just take a look at what he first says on page 5 if you have your book. This is a regular numeral 5. He says, I trust that out of kindness you will accept it. This is in the second paragraph. I trust out of kindness that you will accept it, taking account of the fact that there is no greater gift that I can present to you than the opportunity to understand after a few hours of reading everything I have learned over the course of so many years and have undergone so many discomforts and dangers to discover. So this is how Machiavelli characterizes his gift to Lorenzo. It encompasses everything that he knows. Okay? And it's a little bit humbling because he's basically saying Lorenzo can learn everything Machiavelli knows in just a few hours. Okay? Machiavelli has lived a life as an ambassador, as a trainer of troops, okay? And he is now out in the countryside in this exile. So he has had a very interesting and sometimes difficult life. But it all can be summed up as far as what he knows into this little book and be read in a few hours. But is he really telling the truth here? Okay. From what we know about what he was doing, he couldn't possibly be telling the whole truth here. Because the prince focuses on founding, it focuses on the creation of a government, and not upon republican government or democracy at all. Okay? He doesn't mention those topics here for the most part. Okay? And yet we know that he wrote that other big book dealing with representative form of government, which he thought was better in the long run. Okay? So I don't think that he's quite telling it all here, and this isn't everything that Machiavelli knows. It's a lot, but it's not everything. So in a way, those who don't trust Machiavelli anyway say, Machiavelli is deceptive from the start. Machiavelli is an interestingly deceptive character. Okay? He will try to deceive the prince into thinking that this is everything that he knows and everything that you need to know. And he will just try to teach the prince how to deceive the people, because deception is the way to rule in Machiavelli's view. Okay? He even tries to deceive the reader in places, the average reader like us, and maybe Lorenzo too, by saying things that contradict themselves. Okay? In the course of his discussion, he contradicts himself and leaves you with one impression, whereas if you read a little bit more carefully, you get a different impression. All of that is, I think, fairly conscious. Machiavelli is not a confused man, but he's really rather tricky in the way that he writes in places. So we'll look at some of that. But that's an early indication that Machiavelli doesn't always say everything that he thinks. Okay? He's careful, but he knows his audience. And of course, you don't want to tell Lorenzo that you admire republicanism. That's the whole reason why Machiavelli is out there suffering. Okay? So Machiavelli goes on in this letter to describe his lowly position. And again, this is not uncommon to say, I, the lowly, humble servant of the great majesty, whoever, serve you and admire you and so forth. But Machiavelli takes what would normally be a sort of pat thing to say, and again, makes you wonder, if you're reading carefully, if Lorenzo read it at all, which we don't know if he did, he might have some questions about whether Machiavelli really feels so lowly. If you take a look on the top of page 6, he says, "I hope it will not be thought presumptuous for someone of humble and lowly status to dare to discuss the behavior of rulers and to make recommendations regarding policy. Just as those who paint landscapes set up their easels down in the valley in order to portray the nature of the mountains and the peaks, and climb up into the mountains in order to draw the valleys, similarly, in order to properly understand the behavior of the lower classes, one needs to be a ruler, and in order to properly understand the behavior of rulers, one needs to be a member of the lower classes." Now, what's he really saying there about himself and about the prince? What do you get out of that brief paragraph about the position Machiavelli really sees himself in relation to this man, Lorenzo? Mm-hmm.
I think he's just saying that you've got to be able to look at everything on both sides of the equation from different points of view.
Right.
You look from the top down and from the bottom up, and you've got to understand both sets of circumstances.
He's definitely saying that. Yes, that was very well put, that he's saying that you have to look at all different sides. You have to look from the top and you have to look from the bottom. You have to have a complete objective perspective, right? But if you only look at a problem or an issue from one perspective, you only get part of the picture. So this is definitely something that Machiavelli wants to do. He wants to try to become more objective. Now, if you were the prince and you read this, what would you think about it? I mean, one statement would not be so bad. The statement that he knows more about the common people. I'm sure that you would say, well, yes, I do. You know, because I'm noble and I know that they're vulgar and I know that they, you know, I understand them. Okay. But what about that last statement where he says that it takes somebody from the lower classes to know about the nobility, to be able to see them clearly? What do you think the prince would think about that statement?
I think it's a great put down.
Mm-hmm. It would feel that way, wouldn't it? It would feel like a put down. Okay. Machiavelli, I don't think maybe he's not. I don't think he's trying to insult him, but it would feel insulting, perhaps. Okay, because what do they know about me? I mean, they're not educated. You know, they live out there and farm. You know, what do they know about politics and about all the things that I know and appreciate? They know nothing. What could somebody from the lower classes add to my knowledge about how to run a country? Okay, so this is a suggestion that Machiavelli makes that's really controversial. You wouldn't normally say this to a prince or a member of the nobility. It's something that might be said by a modern Democrat or a Marxist even, to put this much attention upon the people and the people's view of the leadership. Okay? So this is a sort of revolutionary statement here, and he follows through in this book with that statement, with an awful lot of attention to how the common people see the prince. You have to understand how the common people see the prince if you're going to really rule them well. You have to understand how they think and how they see leadership. And some of what they think about leadership is really valid. Okay, you have to pay attention to it. For instance, if they think that high taxation is really hard on them, and it discourages them from enterprise, that's something the prince needs to pay attention to. He needs to listen to them. So Machiavelli says exactly that in his chapter on parsimony and liberality, which we'll get to later. So, yeah, I think that this is a statement that we could accept now because we're very democratically minded people now. But back in these days, when it was still very much accepted that the nobility were different types of human beings, really, people who were far superior to the common man, in so many ways, not just education, but in quality of character, the idea that the common man would have anything to add to the prince's knowledge of his own job would be outrageous. Okay? So this would be a very challenging statement. Basically, he's saying that he is qualified to give advice because he can see the high, that is the nobility, with greater perspective because he's down low. Just as you can see the whole mountain range if you're down in the valley. You can see the big picture. You can see, in other words, if the prince is making a mistake by sending troops over here to help Prince X, okay, more clearly than the prince can, who's caught up in perhaps his own personal intrigues. Princes were concerned about many things that were sort of irrelevant politically even, like who their son was going to marry, which nobleman's daughter was he going to marry, or, religious disputes, okay? So there were lots of things that the prince was concerned about that were more matters of his personal ego than about the welfare of the country as a whole. And so somebody who is of the people is going to be able to see that folly of the prince better than he can see it himself. So the underlying truth here is that it is hard for leaders, not just princes, but if we're going to make this of contemporary relevance, it's hard for leaders, people in positions of power, to see themselves objectively. And the reason for that is, as I put it here, ego, okay, or pride. The reason for that is that human nature is such that we have this element in it, pride, which when we allow it to get out of control can blind us to realities. Okay? Now, a lot of us are not in a position to let it get out of control because we have to, for instance, we have to keep a job. If we lose our job, we won't be able to survive. Okay? So we are somewhat humbled by that fact, and we will continue to do our job. However, people in positions of power or great wealth, they're in a position where they don't have a lot of restraints or realities that just have to impinge upon them. Okay? So they're more likely to allow themselves that vice of pride or ego and to not realize how much it's hurting them. Okay? Some monarchs and princes even got so egotistical that they just lived at court in their own little world without any knowledge or reference to people out there, whether they were comfortable or whether their country was in danger and whatnot. They just enjoyed their wealth and their entertainments and so forth and forgot about everybody else. Okay? So, important to remember that this insight is a part of the realist view. That you have to get rid of pride. You have to check your own ego at the door when you start making decisions about the state. Because otherwise you won't be clear-eyed enough to do it right. You can't, for instance, hold on to a policy just because you came up with it. If it looks like it's not working anymore, you have to be able to say, it's not working, I'm going to change. But too many people wed themselves to a particular idea or policy, and they will not change. They keep trying to justify it somehow. And I'm sure that you've seen this in American politics plenty of times. Justifying a particular program, for instance, that hasn't worked in 20 years, but it's a part of who you are. Perhaps as a legislator, you're the author of the darn thing, or one of the co-sponsors, and your constituents, some of them, are employed by it, okay? So people will continue to justify things that they create, whether they work or not. Machiavelli says you've got to be able to cut off those things which do not work. So having said that, you can see that even the letter to Lorenzo here is not traditional after all. It's just like the whole book. It's a non-traditional statement being made within a traditional form. It starts off and ends with effusive flattery, just like you would expect. But in the middle, there's these statements that if Lorenzo actually read them, he would have to think, hey, this is not a guy who's ready to bow before me and just tell me what I want to hear. Okay? So it ends with, I beg your magnificence to read this, in other words, to pay attention to me, please pay attention to me, and it is my dearest wish that you be great. Okay? Now, I don't think that Machiavelli's dearest wish was for anybody in particular to be great. And in fact, you see in this book that maybe his dearest wish is actually the unification of Italy and it, you know, the Italian unity brought about by his pride for his country. Okay, but of course he has to say this: I care more about you than anyone else in the world. Right. Okay. Any questions or comments about this letter to Lorenzo? Sets it up pretty well. If we sort of get an insight on Machiavelli's character here. Now, Machiavelli says at the beginning of the book, it is my purpose to dispute how one is able to govern and maintain a variety of principalities. Okay? So he's not going to look at republican governments at all. He's going to look at principalities, and there are a variety of types which he will get into. Okay? He will spend most of his time on principalities that are acquired by force, because that's the most challenging way of acquiring them, and the type that needs the most help and the most advice. And he says that he is not going to talk about how one ought to do this, or even if one ought to do it, but only about how one can do it. He's going to tell us how one can. In other words, if you want to do this, if you want to acquire new territory or govern your principality, then I will give you advice as to how to do it. Okay? I'm not going to tell you you should, and you're not going to get into any sort of moral arguments here about whether it's good or not to do these things. So right away, he tries to take a morally neutral stance. Okay? Machiavelli, I think, sees himself primarily this way when he's giving you his analysis. He wants to say, I'm going to leave morality to one side. Okay? You get to decide how you want to use the advice. So in a way, it's reminiscent of Gorgias's opinion about rhetoric. Gorgias saying, I got this teaching, okay? If my students use it for bad things, as you define it, well then, you know, that's their fault. I'm just teaching a skill. Machiavelli is teaching a skill. And again, this is very, very much a part of the realist perspective, to put morality to one side. Most realists don't go so far as to say morality doesn't exist, but they say that I'm not going to talk about it because when it comes to international relations, it is not useful. Okay, you know, morality exists in, say, more effectively in private life, and so does religion. But when it comes to the international sphere, nobody acts on it, so therefore you can't talk about it. So we'll put it aside. All right. Well, this is one way that Machiavelli has been seen by others. As I think I mentioned to you before I left last week, Shakespeare picked up on Machiavelli's writings right away and used Machiavelli's name as synonymous with evil. The evil character was the Machiavel. Okay? And so right from the start, Machiavelli had this reputation, which was also the church's opinion, you know, that this was a dangerous teaching, that this was a dangerous, immoral teaching. And indeed, there's just lots of stuff in this book that is shocking, even for today. More so maybe back then, especially when he deals with religion, which was very much near and dear to most people. You know, he says things that just sort of blow you away with their frankness. So let's take a look at an early example of this. In the chapter 2, Machiavelli compares hereditary principalities and new principalities. Okay? So these are two different kinds of prince. The one inherits his throne from his father, usually, and then follows in his father's footsteps, hopefully, in Machiavelli's view. Okay? And the other one goes off and acquires new territory by force, by taking it from somebody else, and imposes his leadership on this territory. Now, of the hereditary prince, he says, you have an easy job, okay? Because all you have to do is stay with your traditional way of doing things. Whatever your father or your uncle did, you do too, okay? You just act the way he did. You don't make any great big innovations, all right? Now, sometimes, even though you do this, somebody's going to come along and try to take over. Either that might be a member of the nobility, or members of the nobility who gang up on you to take over, or it might be some outside prince who tries to acquire your territory. This can happen. When that happens, he says, the hereditary prince is in a marvelous situation compared to the other type, because all he has to do is sort of sit back, you know, somewhere else and wait until the people get upset with the new ruler, which is going to happen right away. Okay. Let's say that the people even helped the new ruler come into power because they were somewhat upset with, say, their economic condition or whatever. Okay. But this new person comes in, and inevitably, he's not going to be able to deliver what they expect fast enough. Okay. In fact, usually things get worse right after a transition of power. Okay. And, you know, for a lot of reasons, there's usually violence attached to it, so there has to be recovery from that. But also, this person doesn't know how to do it. They don't know the people. They don't know the territory and so forth, as well as the old. So probably things are going to get worse. And at any rate, people's expectations are going to be high because they're going to think, hey, this person's coming in. I expect this person to take care of all the problems, crime, you know, the fact that I don't have enough money, whatever. When he doesn't do that, they're going to be very disappointed very fast. So let's say that you've been ousted and you would be living with some other person, some other member of the nobility, okay, that takes you in, helps you out, and so forth. You can wait. You can let people know that you're still available. You can let people know that you are their friend, okay? And when they start getting dissatisfied, the first person they're going to think about is you, the old prince. And they're going to say, hey, things really weren't so bad. This new guy's terrible. Things really weren't so bad with this. And you can use that dissatisfaction to foment a revolution, a change again in leadership, to get people on your side so that you can come back. Okay? So the hereditary prince has it pretty good. But those who take territory by force, which he calls the new prince or the new principalities, they're in a different situation. They've either taken the territory through war, or they have taken it through sedition, because one side has, like I said, invited them in and helped them to get rid of the old prince and install the new one. Okay? Well, as I said, the expectations are high, so this is the advice that Machiavelli gives to make sure, to say to the prince, you've got to make sure that these people do not become critical of you. Do not think about the ex-ruler and how much better he was. And he says this on page 7. It's near the bottom of the page. He says, you always have to give offense to those over whom you acquire power when you become a new ruler, both by imposing troops on them and by countless other injuries that follow as necessary consequences of the acquisition of power. Well, that really kind of loses its force. One thing I've noticed is that this translation sometimes isn't as powerful, okay, as a more literal translation, although it certainly is more readable. So I provided a more literal translation up here because I think this gets to very much what Machiavelli has in mind. He says, a prince who acquires this new land and is faced with these disgruntled people who want a lot that you can't deliver, he says, that prince must always hurt those whose new prince he becomes, and hurt them with men-at-arms and with infinite other injuries that the new acquisition drags with it. Okay, that's much more forthright. Okay. Well, now, does that make sense to you, that you come into a new territory and you immediately hurt the people whose new prince you have just become? Why would you do that? Wouldn't that make them hate you and want to get rid of you ever more? Why do you think Machiavelli gives this advice? Mm-hmm.
So it really seems powerful, and it's like a level of fear there, so people don't. It has to be, if the ruler comes in and seems to be apathetic and not powerful, not something to be feared, then more likely to feel something.
Right. Yeah. Well, you've mentioned the key word there, fear. You know, what attitude they have when they're critical is boldness. They're bold and they're arrogant, thinking that they can be critical of the new leader. That should say to the leader, these people are far too bold, okay, that I need to remind them of what this government is truly based upon. And if I do, they'll stop criticizing. So this is why he recommends this. Now think about this from the perspective of Machiavelli's own life. That is what Lorenzo and the D'Medici family did when they came back into Florence. Okay? They rounded up people who were associated with the government. They didn't stop to ask a lot of questions about who was guilty and who was innocent. They killed some, they tortured others, and they established their supremacy without a lot of complaints and criticisms. They did that right away. Okay? So, strangely enough, Machiavelli, having gone through that, okay, this is the sort of eerie coldness of some of Machiavelli's advice. Having gone through that, he can see the utility of it. Okay? What the prince needs to avoid, and what Machiavelli is telling him to avoid, is people's contempt. Okay? And you put that very well by saying, you know, they won't take him seriously, more or less. You know, if he's sort of apathetic, if he just sort of sits there and takes criticism, okay? So Machiavelli is admiring that very tactic that was used against him here and saying it's effective. Is it just? Okay. No, it's not just, because the prince, in doing this, ignores whether people are guilty or innocent, whether they really are a threat or not. And justice is all about making that evaluation, and of course being right yourself before you apply it, right? So it's not about justice, it's about being effective. In other words, if you want to hang on to your power, this is what you have to do. To make it very clear, he says, those who hesitate, those who waffle, will lose their state. You come in and you wait too long, if you think you've got to have trials, for instance, or investigations, you will lose your state. They will bring back the old ruler. You don't have a lot of time, in other words, to make the impression upon people that you're in charge, and you won't brook any criticism. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's not the best form of government. That's not the strongest form of government, because when you have people that are fearful of you, they're going to resent you. And you're always going to have that threat in the background, right? That they're going to find a way to get rid of you at some point, if not now, then later, right? And it's also not the strongest form of government, because at this point the prince isn't listening to the people and their needs. And we think that, and I think Machiavelli does too, that it's important for a government to listen to people and their needs. Machiavelli tries to correct this impression later on. For instance, he makes it very clear that this type of action should not be done always, but only for a short period of time and at the beginning of your administration. And maybe later on, if things become out of order again, you may have to repeat it. But you cannot keep it up. You cannot keep a reign of terror up, because then you will make people hate you. Okay? So he does acknowledge that. Whether that's good enough, we'll have to see. Okay? But he says at the end of this discussion, those who have lost a state and conquered it again never make that same mistake. Okay? They then develop a harder heart than they had before, and they punish that rebellion as quickly as possible. Okay, so now what do you do next? Once you've sort of consolidated your power, then what do you do? Well, again, Machiavelli shocks us in our contemporary sensibilities by advocating colonization. Okay? Today, colonization is a dirty word. You know, in the light of all the history of the colonial powers in Africa and Latin America and so forth, we don't like colonial government. We don't like imperialism. Okay, but Machiavelli says this is the only way that you can really assure in the long run that this territory will be yours. Okay? You place your own people there. You send out people from your own home territory there to live there and to help you govern them, and also to get to know them and to understand these new people. Okay? It's even best, he says, if you can go there and live yourself, but if you can't do that, then at least send out colonies. Okay? And another bit of advice that he gives is not to make the powerful any more powerful, but in fact to weaken them. When you go into that new land, there will be those who have had money and position for a long time. And I think that the first instinct of a prince is to say, oh, these are the people I need to talk to, because they're like myself. And besides, they have armor and they have weapons and they're powerful, so I need to talk to them. And indeed, you don't want to antagonize them right away. But you cannot just pay attention to them or make them more powerful, because guess what? They're the people that can overthrow you the most easily. Okay? So in whatever you do, you have to try to weaken them and actually pay more attention to the common people, he says. Help the common people out. Give them the impression that you're a good leader. And over time, try to weaken these nobles. Maybe take away some of their land, charge them excessively, make them serve long and hard. Back at this time, the nobles had an agreement with the prince, and with their, the other vassals had agreement with nobles and so forth to do military service. Okay? And so, make them do it, and make them spend a lot of their own money to do it, okay? So that they become poorer. So you do this over time. But, again, notice this is not the typical advice that the prince would receive. Weaken the powerful, strengthen the weak. Okay? And we're going to see why he thinks it's so important to make the weaker a little bit stronger. But he does know that the nobility are the main source of the threat. They're smart, they're wealthy, they're better equipped, and so forth. So you've got to think of them right away. And some of those you would kill, some of those you would terrorize, and some of them you would just weaken over time. All the while not telling them or giving any indication of your overall plan, obviously. So he sums up by saying that you should really nip all resistance in the bud, which means you ought to stop resistance before it starts. He says on page 11, it is necessary not only to pay attention to immediate crises, but to foresee those that will come, and to make every effort to prevent them. For if you see them coming well in advance, then you can easily take the appropriate action to remedy them. But if you wait until they are right on top of you, and the prescription will no longer take effect because the disease is too far advanced. In this matter it is, as doctors say, of consumption, which is a sort of pneumonia. In the beginning, the disease is easy to cure but difficult to diagnose. But after a while, if it has not been diagnosed and treated early, it becomes easy to diagnose and hard to cure. Well, obviously, Machiavelli is not talking about medical matters here. This is an analogy. He's talking about political diseases. Okay? And the number one political disease is rebellion. Okay? So, again, in this way he is saying you have to stop rebellion before it starts, and you do that by the fear that you plant in people's hearts. If you let up later, then they're very grateful and happy for themselves. But right away you have to do this, and you have to be attempting to weaken those who can get you. Okay? This is a great quote. Okay, and again, any realist would say this. Any realist would agree with this. War is not to be avoided, but is only to be deferred to the advantage of others. The longer you wait, the more likely it is that you will lose. Okay? But if you go and do these things right away, you take the initiative, it is on your side instead of their side. You can behave in a way that is unpredictable, and that gives you the advantage. Okay, so we've just looked at an example of one way to understand Machiavelli. In my discussion here, I've emphasized Machiavelli's supposed immorality, his ruthlessness, okay? The fact that he advises you to ignore justice and just to be cruel to people because it gets results, okay? And so this is one interpretation of Machiavelli, and there's lots of ammo for this particular interpretation. I call it the dangerous teaching interpretation. Okay? It is critical. It's a critical perspective that says that Machiavelli is the first political philosopher who basically openly tells leaders to ignore moral considerations, okay? And teaches them how to win and hold power simply by force and fraud. It's not that leaders hadn't done this in the past, or even that philosophers had not mentioned it. We see that with the Gorgias, they mention it. But rather that in the past the message had been, you shouldn't do this, or it had been sort of veiled suggestion that maybe this would be effective. Okay? But here you have Machiavelli just coming right out, saying it. Okay? So in that sense, maybe he's doing something fairly new. Okay? They say he started something. That is, the critics say Machiavelli started something which then became a sort of moving, snowball that kept growing and growing as it rolled down the hill towards modern times. They say that Machiavelli is the first modern political philosopher because of this insight. And what you see in all later political philosophers, or at least most of them, is this astounding realism and this separation between morality and politics. Okay? And that is regardless of whether we're looking at, say, a liberal philosopher or a classical conservative philosopher or just about any type of philosophy in the modern world. There is this tension and this hesitation to speak in moral terms after this. Okay? So we will, of course, be visiting this interpretation, but it's important to note that it's not just a revulsion to what he says, like, oh, yuck, I couldn't do that. It's a criticism that has to do with what he started and in the history of political philosophy, that these people say this is now the way we think. Okay, that the modern mind thinks basically the way Machiavelli thinks, and that is bad for us. That we should think more like Plato and less like Machiavelli. Okay. There's a second interpretation that we're going to cover. And what I'd like you to do with all three of these is, as you read the book, just think about them a little bit and think about which one you see more coming through, which one you agree with more. But the second interpretation calls Machiavelli the first political scientist. Okay? And they say that because they believe that Machiavelli it's not about morality or immorality, but rather he has finally arrived at objectivity. Okay. Whereas previous philosophers were not objective, they were trying to push their particular moral agenda. Machiavelli is actually doing what he says he's doing. He's looking at human behavior as objectively as he can. He's putting the moral questions to one side, but he's doing that so that he can educate us about how politics really works. And in many places he gives you this impression that he himself understands himself as this morally neutral observer who's not trying to push some sort of evil agenda. He's trying to educate us. On page 13, there's a passage which has been used as one of the sources for the typical quotation from Machiavelli, the ends justifies the means. He doesn't say that. Okay, nowhere does he say that, but he does come close to getting the meaning of it anyway. But here he says, it is perfectly natural and normal to want to acquire new territory. Okay. Based on what he observed in the world around him, it would seem so. Everybody wanted to do it. Okay? And so he says, and whenever men do what will succeed towards this end, they will be praised, or at least not condemned. Okay? What's he saying there? Praised by whom? He's not saying I praise them here. Okay? But he's saying they will be praised. He's making a historical observation. Nothing succeeds like success. If you win a war, no matter how you do it, and you come out on the other end successful, people will change their mind about it. They will praise what you did. Okay? They're not really all that concerned about the means of how you do it. Okay? Likewise, if you fail, no matter how well your means were done, no matter how just you were, no matter how well-meaning you were, it doesn't matter. They will blame you. And they will attribute all sorts of bad things to you just simply because you fail. Well, that's still, I mean, that's the contemporary democratic problem with foreign policy in a nutshell, isn't it? That, you know, if a president decides to wage war and it turns out to be a total success, people support it. If they can find any fault with it at all, they cease to support it. It's, you know, I mean, it's a common human trait that doesn't have to do with Renaissance Italy. It really has to do with human nature. And he's just observing that here. When you succeed, people like it. And they just sort of stop thinking about how you did it. So what Machiavelli is saying here, first of all, is that the prince needs to focus on success. Okay? Now, in our modern world, we often think the same, but we also say the man needs to have good intentions, or now the woman needs to have good intentions. In this position of power, the person has to have a proper perspective on justice. And we need to see that they're motivated by justice or human rights and what they do and so forth. Machiavelli comes from that older, more pagan perspective. Even though he's living in a Christian world, it's a pagan perspective that he admires, which says the most virtuous thing is success. Okay? If you know how to get it, you should be praised, and people will praise you. So he's saying something about how people react here, but this isn't necessarily a high endorsement at this point of any particular action, but simply describing the way people see these things. Okay, so there's some evidence of moral neutrality. And this has been used by modern political scientists to associate Machiavelli with the stance of a reporter or an objective social scientist. And in fact, I've seen lots of textbooks that said Machiavelli, the father of political science or social science, you know, because, you know, contemporary social scientists like myself and others in the Department of Political Science have as their ideal objective analysis of people's behavior, and then the development of laws or rules, theories, that come out of the analysis of people's behavior, so that we can become more effective at doing our governing or at being citizens, depending on who's using the material. Okay? So we like Machiavelli, I guess, in political science, and tend to see Machiavelli as one of ours. Given these ends, Machiavelli asks, what means have been used and have worked? And this is why he looks so much at contemporary and past history, is so that he can analyze it and say, okay, what really worked? Did it work to, say, hire mercenaries in this particular situation? Those are soldiers that you pay. Or did it work to use nobles? Okay, would it have worked better if the person had used a common man? So he looks at various examples from history, and he shows how one tactic worked to get the prince's goal or the leader's goal, and another tactic did not. Okay, well, that's pretty close to what many of the political scientists try to do. Okay? What works, what doesn't for particular goals. Okay, so Machiavelli acknowledges that most leaders really have the ends of more power. That is, the end or goal that they have is more power for themselves, which again, he could be seen as not endorsing, but just simply stating. Okay? Even if they say that they have as their end, for instance, the, I don't know, spread of Christianity in his time, or making the world a better place in our time, right? Whatever goals you have. Even if they say that, what they really are interested in is their own power. Okay? And in fact, it's a fact for Machiavelli and not a moral value for him. I think it's disputable. I think that you could say, indeed, that it is a moral value for Machiavelli. I think there's arguments in the book that suggest that Machiavelli thinks it's almost immoral to try to be too good, because you're so ineffective when you're good in foreign policy that it's almost a crime, okay? Is you damage yourself and your people more when you ignore the rules of realism, and it's almost immoral. Okay? So I can see Machiavelli from that perspective too. But the political scientist tends to see Machiavelli as not making the moral statements, but just talking about facts. A third interpretation that we're going to look at is Machiavelli as patriot. Machiavelli is concerned with the well-being of Italy and the unification of Italy. Let me just for a second put up here again this map that you have of Italy, and then I'll let you copy more here. But Italy was one of the last European states actually to unify. Okay, it happened in the 19th century. Okay, when they really became a completely unified state. It certainly didn't happen any time around Machiavelli. Okay? But Machiavelli wanted it to happen. He could see that other kingdoms in Europe were consolidating their power, and that the more that they consolidated that power under one king, the more of a threat they would be to countries like Italy that were still divided up. The Italians had their ethnicity and their language in common, basically, okay? Just like the French and the Spaniards had. And these other people were using that commonality partly as a way to consolidate their power, okay? But in Italy, they had not been able to do that. Part of the reason, in his view, was the power of the Papal States, which was just powerful enough to keep the rest of Italy divided, but not powerful enough to unify it, or didn't have the interest in doing so. So you can see that there were some kingdoms here. There's the Papal States, the republics of Florence and Siena, and Lucca, and other places up here, principalities as well. Okay, and they were having a great time fighting amongst themselves. Okay, they were just having a great time with their squabbles, fighting amongst themselves, and bringing in other European powers in the pursuit of their own selfish designs. Okay, so it was a mess, and I think that Machiavelli saw a future for Italy of great power. Now, the past of Italy was partly about the Roman Empire. Okay, and so everybody knew that, and Machiavelli knows that, and so that's partly why he talks about the Roman Empire so much. The Italians could use that past to inspire them once again to become great, and so he very much wants to remind people that at a different time, people in this area were quite capable of doing much greater things than they are now. He sees this time almost as a time of decadence. It is a time of decadence. It's decadent in so many ways. Okay? They are almost barbarians themselves in his view, but he says in order to unify them, he says we need to think less about our own differences, which are usually personal or over money or over a border. Okay? And we need to think more about the differences that we have with these other nations that can come in and destroy us. And we have the ethnic difference, of course, which separates us from the rest of them. Okay? And if we do that, we will throw the barbarians out. So he actually is one of the first writers that we see making the ethnic argument, saying that we ought to have more pride in our own history, background, and ethnicity. We ought to think of these other folks as barbarians. We ought to think of them as a threat. The distinction is good, So there's nationalism in his argument. This desire to love the nation, to respect the nation, and to unify it on that basis. Now, Machiavelli says most of this towards the end of the book, so we'll deal with this interpretation later on. But one of the things that he says is that Italians are very fatalistic. And what that means is they think that sort of things are out of their control. He blames Christianity for this, actually. Okay? So again, he's really modern in the sense that he's actually looking at Christianity as a social institution and one that teaches people to think a certain way. And he says, the Italians, they put everything in God's hands, or they sort of look at it as their destiny, and they can't act, or they can't act fast enough because of that. Again, they need to think more like pagans, okay? And less like the modern Christian, in his view, and seize their opportunities. Machiavelli says, fortune or chance is like a river that floods. And when it floods, you can't do anything about it. It's out of your control. You're likely to be washed away. But what you can do about floods is you can build structures ahead of time so that when the time comes for the disaster, you're prepared. Machiavelli says you ought to, as Italians, be building those institutions, those political embankments, so to speak, that keep you from the disaster, from the barbarian invasion, right? From rebellion as well. So he's very much about activism, about getting past that characteristic of fatalism and making people act. And he reminds people at the end of the book that they have their own special kind of virtue. He says virtue in Italian hearts is not dead. Remember it, okay? Remember our past. And so this is the third type of interpretation. There are others. But these are the three major ways that you see scholars looking at Machiavelli. The third one, they're all about intent, okay? But the third one is very much about intent. What's Machiavelli really doing this for? Okay, well, if he wants to unify Italy, then he's got to find a prince who can do it. He's got to find a prince who can do it and will take his advice to do it. You can't unify this country if you have many scruples, okay? You can't unify this country if you're going to tell the truth all the time. You have to take these measures in order to do it, okay? So the whole book then would be advice to a prince who can unify Italy, okay? Okay. Do you have any questions about these three different ways to look at things in the book? I'll say just a couple more things before we go, if you don't. Okay. Just a little bit more on interpretation and why it's important. Many of you probably haven't been too exposed to this whole concept of interpretation. Okay? One of the things that primary text courses do, hopefully, is introduce this so that you know that scholars see things more than one way. So that what you get, say, when you read an article or a textbook is probably one perspective and not the whole truth. Okay? In order to get the whole truth, you have to read or examine several different perspectives. Okay? So, understanding that is partly what we're about, how different people can see the same thing so differently. So you have to be careful about how you read other people's opinions and to be a little skeptical of them, to say, well, okay, that's a pretty good argument, but couldn't there be a different way of looking at this? That's partly what makes you a thinking person, is a degree of skepticism. It can turn into a disease. You can be so skeptical that you don't believe anything, which is probably where I'm at. But I think a little bit of skepticism is the only way to be an intelligent person. Okay? So interpretation is the way that we're going to hopefully discover a little bit about that truth, that you can't take everything for granted that you receive, okay, from people, that you've got to do some of the analysis yourself, because there is this disagreement, rather fundamental disagreement. It's not just about Machiavelli, but just about everything, okay? And lots of times in school you don't get all the different perspectives. Lots of times there's not enough time. Or my biggest beef is you get a textbook that tells you, you know, but the one thing that the author thinks is important, and then you have no clue what the rest of the opinions are, or even if they exist. So that's partly what this unit is about, is understanding that. So I want to hear from you and what you think, and whether you agree with any of these interpretations or whether you can formulate one of your own. Okay? So with that, I will let you go a little early so that people can come up. If you need to, please get write down the answers from this answer key if you got your exam today. And if any of you still need an exam, there's some more up here, okay?